This is Tear Off the Tape, a project from the group at I Got Mind, discussing the often overlooked emotional and psychological toll of trauma. Now, here's your host, Bob Wilkie.
Hi, everybody, and welcome to another episode of Tear Off the Tape. I'm your host, Bob Wilkie. Really excited about the conversation that I'm going to have today. You know, it's been a while since we've been able to lock a guest down, and I hope that you've listened to the other episodes that are out there. They're all inspiring. You know, people go through different things in life, and it's that acknowledgement of something's happened to you. And yeah, the whole purpose of the podcast is to make sure that we're tearing off that tape, which represents, overcoming that injury. The more that we talk about these things, the more likely we are to find the peace and joy that we all, search for and deserve. So Alan Kanerva is our next guest here today. Really excited about Alan. He's got a lot of different stories that he's going to share and a lot of great work that he's doing. So I'm going to bring Alan in. Alan, thank you so much for being here today and joining us.
Thank you, Bob. I love your studio, man.
Yeah, it's lots of fun, right? Technology and figuring stuff out. The world is a fantastic place today if you know how to manage it. So you're coming to us from Guelph, Ontario, as we start the Tear Off the Tape. And thanks for tearing off the tape with us here today, Alan. Tell us a little bit about where you grew up and how you grew up, because we know that sometimes the beginning of our story can be where the trauma begins.
I'm the son of an immigrant. My dad came from Finland in 1923. Ended up in Northern Ontario. I guess Northern Ontario looks like Finland. And I grew up in a little mining town. My earliest thoughts or my earliest perceptions about trauma, by and large, I had a great childhood, given free range to wander the bush and learn about life. But a couple of things always stand out. I remember coming home one afternoon. My dad came home from work. It was summertime. He asked what had happened that day, and I told him that I'd been up in a cave. We were in a hard rock mining community in Levac, Ontario, and that I got stuck in a cave underground. And the look on his face, I still remember it, or some recall of it. And he said, "Show me the cave," and we left. And sure enough, there was this cave under a big chunk of rock, and I got stuck in the cave. My hands were above me like this, and I got stuck at my chest. I could not move forward, and I could not move back. And fortunately, a couple of friends of mine dragged me out by the feet. And that's sort of my first recollection about having one of the hallmark emotions of trauma. The three hallmarks of trauma are fear, terror, and helplessness. And then the other event in that young childhood is getting a new bicycle. And they had just paved the streets in this little mining town, and the one street led down a short hill, and then it became gravel, and then it was a creek. So as young kids do, we'd come ripping down this hill on our bike, plug our brakes, skid on the pavement, and then hit the gravel. And I did that repetitive times. And then one time I didn't get stopped fast enough, and I went over the embankment into the creek. A couple minutes later, my neighbor comes in and pulls me out by the scruff of the neck. He had been sitting on his front steps and watched me go down the street multiple times, and then this time didn't come out. Wow. Had he not pulled me out, I think that would have been my last bicycle trip, because I was face down in the creek, broken arm, not able to move. So if he didn't save my life, it was close to it, Bob. And he carried me home, of course, handed me. So I have those two memories from early youth, and they never bothered me. I wasn't impacted till I got to Moose Jaw, and I was starting to fly the Tudor jet. I went for my first simulator ride. And you're in a small little cockpit simulator, and they have an opaque canopy. You're in your complete flying suit. You're harnessed in. You have your helmet. I put on my oxygen mask, and I notice that I'm starting to breathe, short sort of gasp. And I'm like 22, 20 years old. I'm fit. I'm strong. I'm healthy, and I can't figure out what's going on. And then they close the canopy down, and I feel my heart rate going up. And of course, the instructor in the box, he can hear my respiration rate. He goes, "Alan, are you okay?" And "Yeah, I'm okay. It's all good." And he said, "All right." We start the exercise. And then I had to put my helmet bag over my helmet, over the mask, over the oxygen, and find circuit breakers fully masked. Man, that was a challenge. That I barely made it out of the box that day, and I had to cope. right? So I got coping mechanisms, which so many of us who are carrying shit do. Sorry for the language, but we get coping strategies, right? So, but I had to get through there. Fast forward 1990, I came home from the Middle East and I knew I wasn't right. I knew I was broken. And I did a course in neurolinguistic programming, NLP. And I dealt with what I thought was claustrophobia, but it was actually the event in that cave and then that canopy closing. They were connected. There was a lineage connecting them. And so those were my, early childhood recollections of something that would have been considered traumatic, but then was impacting me as an adult, and very negatively, very negatively.
It's interesting how we go through those things and we just don't understand the connection, right? Like you, I had lots of those things as a kid. I remember I got ran over a couple of times. Never really thought anything of it, but later on in life, you go through something and it flashes you back to those moments, right? And it's just amazing the damage that it can do. Really interesting. I just want to go back a little bit. You talk about the three things. Let's talk about those for a second. Those three things that kind of activate and program the trauma into us. You said fear, terror, and hopelessness. Can you expand on that a little bit?
Helplessness. Yeah, a lot of people have sadness and grief and all those things. Those aren't the emotions of trauma. Trauma is, if you listen to Gabor Mate or Bessel van der Kolk, they're very, very clear. A traumatic event is a tragedy that has some element of life-threatening where you feel absolute fear, potential terror, or you're helpless to stop what's happening to you. But here's the kicker. MIT did a study. So 3 ways you get traumatized. Something bad happens to you, right? That's obvious, right? And that puts intense fear, terror, or a sense of helplessness. You can't prevent what's coming. What you do to others is equally traumatizing. So if you hit somebody in a crosswalk with your car, the fear, the terror of maybe you killed somebody, and the helplessness and I've dealt with lots of clients on that level. But when MIT did the study, the most traumatizing thing that can happen is you witnessing something happening to another human being that you either choose to or you're unable to intervene on, this intense sense of helplessness. And this gets into a lot of stuff, but this is also the area where soldiers and police officers who witness stuff happening to others that are in firemen and EMS, and they can't intervene, right? I believe it's the realm of moral injuries as well for soldiers. They're witnessing what they're doing to others and they feel helpless to not do it, or they see their comrades get hurt and there's nothing they can do to protect them. And the trauma from that is intense. So yeah, fear, terror, and helplessness. And those are the emotions we always measure when we're doing any intervention. And my understanding and my experience with hundreds and hundreds of clients is that trauma prevents grieving. Trauma prevents grieving because you're always triggered into fear, terror, and helplessness. When the event comes up, you're full of fear, you're full of terror, and you don't get a chance to grieve. To grieve, you actually submit to the emotions and it's cathartic. There's a release. Well, when you're traumatized, your amygdala is not going to let you submit to anything. No, it's going to be on guard for you all the time. You're in survival mode. So a lot of times when I clear really intense traumas with people, the one gentleman I worked with was a U.S. Marine major, and he flew helicopters for the Marines, and he flew the same kind of helicopter I flew. So we had instant rapport with each other, right? Flying these military helicopters, and we'd both been in Iraq. And I cleared this massive trauma he had, and then he called me from his home. He said, I need help. I said, why do you need help? He said, I'm in my pickup truck in the driveway. I'm crying. And I said, good. He said, what do you mean good? I'm a Marine major. And I said, well, trauma prevents you from grieving. You need to grieve. You need to let that out. And he cried for some period of time. Then he called me back and he said, thank you. It's the first time I've been able to actually grieve what went on. And the first time anybody's, not that I need permission, but it's the first time anybody's given me permission and said, it's okay. In fact, not okay. It's mandatory. You got to do it.
So let's go back out. You had these experiences that you recognized as a kid that in the future kind of activated for you. But you talked about how you end up in Moose Jaw. So you've grown up, you've made a decision to join the military. Obviously, you're in Moose Jaw and you're flying. Tell us a little bit about that.
Well, and life throws you curveballs or fastballs, right? I'm the youngest of 6 kids, and 3 older brothers, all capable, gifted people. I was mentioning earlier that my one brother played for the Peterborough Petes when Scotty Boland was coach there. My other brother was the biggest snowmobile dealer in the world. So I lived in this family of 6, and I was the youngest, and I was what was called a sickly kid. I had rheumatic fever, scarlet fever, pneumonia twice. I was sick all the time. And so as a young man, my father desperately wanted one of his kids to become a pilot. And I think, to be fair, Bob, that one of my motivations to become a pilot was to usurp my brothers, right? So I joined the military. And as soon as I joined the military, I went from status 6 to status 1 in my own mind, but I probably rose in status. And I get to Moose Jaw. In the military, they sent me to university. I had to finish my degree. And then once I finished my degree, I went to Moose Jaw and learned to fly airplanes. And I get to Moose Jaw, and then my dad decides to have a heart operation in May of that year at St. Michael's in Toronto, which he never came out of. And so I get to Moose Jaw, and then the motivation to fly for my father is not there. And at one juncture, I actually had to quit flying. I couldn't go up and fly anymore. Instead of going up and doing the lesson plans that we were given on our solos, I'd go up and just burn the Queen's fuel by going straight and level. And I finally said, well, I can't do this anymore. And they actually gave me a week off, and they told me, okay, come back. The flight surgeon said, come back in a week and then make your decision. And when I went back in his office a week later, he had my release papers on his desk. I said, no, I've decided to stay. I'm going to do this for myself. And he knew the story of my father. So, Moose Jaw, it was challenging. And in that process, I chose to then fly helicopters, and I ended up flying in Edmonton, Alberta. And not many things bugged me as a young guy. I mean, I had a motorcycle, I had a sports car, I had a helicopter, I had everything, baby. I had a credit card. Life was good. And then we had to do Arctic survival in Resolute Bay. And part of Arctic survival is you build a 2-man igloo. When you build an igloo, you've got a tunnel in, and the snow is like sugar. And so I said to my igloo mate, Paul, I said, I'll dig the tunnel. So I'm going in like a groundhog trying to dig, and I get partway down. I got stuck right there with the snow. I just yelled, Paul, get me out of here. And he pulled me out by my feet, just like when I was a kid. I could not dig that tunnel to get into that igloo. He had to finish it.
Fear, terror, and helplessness, right?
Yeah. And that whole feeling of constriction that comes up high, part of my brain should have said, dig, go through, but not a chance.
It's so interesting that you talk about that, because a lot of times people go through life and they don't realize, right, that they experience something at a younger age. They just know that there's certain situations. So we have those fears, right? Fear of heights, fear of the dark, fear of whatever it is. There's a reason that we have those things. And it was because in the dictionary, trauma is a psychological wound or injury, right? And we've had that. Our brain has said, no, this is a bad situation. I want to go back for a second. You talk about your father, and if you're okay with it, Alan, during that time, you're a young man. A lot of us as young men, are always looking for that approval, that recognition from dad, right? And so you do it. You step out. You're part of a family of achievers. So you're carving your own path, and then dad's no longer there. What were the struggles with that? Because I know that I've had my own when my dad passed. What were some of the things for you as a young man? You talked about grief, and sometimes we don't get to have the grieving process. Did you get to have that grieving process, or is that something you held on to that kind of added to some of these other things that were happening too?
I was fortunate. I'll say I was fortunate, because I was a sickly kid. I spent an amazing amount of time with my mom. I should admit this on a broadcast, but my mom taught me to knit and sew and cook and, as a young boy. And so I spent a ton of time with her. So when my mom passed, I felt my mom and my relationship was complete. When my dad passed, I'd been fortunate enough that a couple of years earlier than that, when I was in grade 13, I bought a crashed 750 Honda, and my dad and I rebuilt it over the summer, and then, got to connect. And when I was in grade 13, I played football. I ran track. I was quite a good skier. But my dad had never seen any of those sports. Nobody had seen me run or play football or ski except in little local events. And in my last year of ski racing in grade 13, my dad actually drove me to every ski race. So I'll say I was super fortunate, Bob, in that I felt really complete with my father and my mother. And yet when I say that, one of my laments as a man is I probably spent 20, 25 years looking for a mentor. More than that. I'll say more than that. 30 years looking for a mentor, looking for that male role model. I think, I think having your male role model taken from you young has a huge impact in your life. I told you I did humanitarian work. When I look at what's happening globally and the young children who are losing their mother and father in war zones, and that the long-term impact of that is significant. So yeah, it's a brilliant question, by the way. And I have young boys and young daughters, but the young boys, I try to impart as much wisdom as my father imparted on me, because he transferred a lot, right, to the best of his ability. None of us go to parenting school.
No, that's the unfortunate part, right? The only frame of reference we have are the ones that modeled that to us. And so we kind of go off of that. And, my family history, my dad was extremely traumatized as a young man, and he was a great dad. He wanted to correct and do all those things. And so, I've learned how to even take it another step further, right? Because of the importance of their brain development and the relationship and what we need to do. And that's where a lot of people, can pass on that trauma, right? Because the things that we don't change or make different, we just pass that shit on to our kids too.
It becomes a norm.
Yeah, well, it is, unfortunately, right? And it is because we're not trauma informed. We don't fully understand, trauma, and we'll get more into that as we go. So now you're in the military, you've gone back, you've made the decision to fly. Tell us what happens in this next chapter as someone who's flying helicopters.
There's a lot of sex, drugs, and rock and roll. There's sex, alcohol, and rock and roll. There was no drugs. Like, again, I was young. I had a helicopter, a sports car, and a motorcycle. But in 1983, in Edmonton, Alberta, Edmonton was a former Strategic Air Command base. The runway goes forever. It's 14,000 feet long. There were multiple squadrons on base. I was with a helicopter squadron, and I was going out on a mission, a trip, and I was on the helipad with the helicopter running. I was the aircraft commander, and the Hercules squadron was doing training down the infield, and they're doing training called LAPES, low altitude parachute extraction. So they have pallets of goods that they allow a parachute to go out the back of the Hercules that pulls the pallet out of the Hercules, and then it goes skidding down the infield. You've seen this on movies, especially any movie about humanitarian or dropping aid into various areas. And so the Herc's going down the runway. It's got, I believe it was 7 crew on board, because they're rotating pilots and crew doing the training. And the parachute goes out the ramp, and the pallet starts moving back, and it turns, it rotates, and it gets jammed on the back ramp of the Hercules. So now the center of gravity of the aircraft, the pallet has moved right to the very extreme back of the aircraft. So now the tail of the aircraft's heavy and it goes vertical. Well, Hercules don't go vertical. So it went about 300 feet vertical. It did a 180 and it came straight down into a burning inferno. So we talked about what happens to us, what happens to others, and then being helpless. So I'm sitting there. I'm a captain in the military. These are my friends. I know them. I know who's in that airplane, right? We've been at the officers' mess. Some of us have come through flying training, and I see this fireball, and I request permission from the tower to go to the crash scene, because I'm already in my helicopter, negative Cobra, my call sign Cobra 27 hold, or Gander 27, sorry, negative Gander 27 hold. Cool. And I request permission again, negative. And the futility of that is you see this fireball, of course. There was nothing I could do, even if I'd gone, right, except cause myself bodily harm. And that didn't come into my forefront, Bob, until 2019. I'm doing a training in Parkland, Florida, to a group of 32 psychotherapists because there'd been the shootings in Parkland in the school. And now I'm doing trainings in the surrounding area. And I go to tell that story. And here's the cool thing. That aircraft's tail numbers are 329. That Herc. 329, an artist rendering of 329, had been in Air Force officers' messes for a decade before that. Why 329? Who knows? But that number. And I went to tell the story in front of these people and I started breaking down. Kid you not, 2019. And I said, hey, can we have a 5-minute break? And I grabbed one of my beers and I said, man, I just got triggered at the front of the room. Let's deal with it. And he just did what we do together, the intervention. And then I went back and I told the story clearly, coherently, without any negative arousal, just like I just told it there. But it was that thing had been sitting there in my unconscious mind, beyond my cognitive, and what I call the latent charge, negative emotional charge, was still with it. I just needed the right context for it to come out and trigger me. And so once we cleared it, it's no longer an affective memory. Again, I can talk about it. And this is what I talk about. This is the definition, my definition of a coherent memory, right? And I can tell that. And so that was, losing 7 peers and a fireball, probably 500 or 700 meters less than that from me. And those things, I think about how as a group of officers, we tried to resolve that. We had a ceremony and then we all went to the officers' mess. And we used to let a writer from the Edmonton Sun travel with us. He had a nickname. He was called Major Danger, but his name was Nick Lees. And he wrote an article. I don't think Nick ever came to ride with any of us after he wrote the article, because in his article the next day, he said, he published something to the effect that there didn't seem a lot of remorse because these pilots were all, we are partying all right. We are drowning our sorrows. I mean, that night was crazy, that night in the mess. And, and there are mess games. Back then you could play mess games. I don't think in our current client, the mess games we played back then could be played. And the drinking would not be tolerated the way it was then. But yeah. And I wonder about my peers who witnessed that. I don't stay in touch with all of them. I have a couple friends from that period, but I wonder how their lives have turned out.
It's such a great example, Alan, of why a lot of people out there can struggle at different times in their life, because life goes on, right? It's behind me, but 20 years later, all of a sudden something happens, and it's like, what is going on? And it's so important that people understand that these events that we have had that we didn't get to process properly still live in there until, like you said, we get to resolve them, identify them, and work through them, that they no longer have that effect. That's the importance of that trauma-informed.
Can I share another story? Just to, I've trained several hundred clinicians to do what I do, right? And one of them, Carrie Rosso in Florida, called me one time. She said, Alan, would you help me with a client? She's an extraordinary clinician. She doesn't need my help. And I said, Carrie, what's going on? She said, well, I've got a guy. He's 97 years old. He's ex-US Air Force, and he's massively traumatized. I said, he's my kind of people. Let's do this. So we go in, and again, we have instant rapport. His story is so powerful. As a 22-year-old in World War II, he's a gunner on the nose of a B-17 bomber going into Germany, on those night raids into Dresden or wherever they went. His best friend is a gunner in a B-17 in the same squadron. So they're flying into Europe together, to go bomb. And he wags his guns at his buddy to say hi. And his buddy goes to wag the guns. And then that airplane disappears, vaporized, gone, just taken out. So Mel, he's 22. He gets through the grief. His career goes on. He becomes a very high-ranking non-commissioned officer, to the point where Chuck Yeager's doing the B1 runs, to break the world speed record. He's actually in the belly of a bomber, and he gets strapped in. Well, the guy who straps Chuck Yeager in is Mel. That's how far he went in his career. So he has this brilliant military career. He retires. He buys a sport fishing boat, a charter boat, and he takes people fishing in Florida. So he's out in the bright sunlight. He's happy. He's active, positive endorphins. And then he sells the business, he retires, he's in his late 60s, early 70s. His wife passes away. So, what's Mel going to do? He starts going to World War II reunions. And then he comes home, he drinks, and the memory's live. And I'll tell you more in a minute why this is so critical. And Mel starts tanking. At 80 years old, the VA diagnosed him with having PTSD. At 80. Now he's 97. So Carrie, I get in rapport with Carrie, but I said, Carrie, you can do this. You do the work. This is your client. I don't need to do the work. Mel did the work with her. He's absolutely trauma-free today. Absolutely trauma-free. He's 104 and trauma-free. So he actually, in the spring of 2020, the weekend that Justin Trudeau closed the borders with COVID, I was teaching in Orlando, right? And they said, how are you going to get home? I said, well, me getting home is not going to be hard. But Mel and his son were in my class. They took my class, right? And Mel came up. I've got pictures with him. In 1998, he gets remarried to a younger woman. 2020, he gets remarried. He's 98. He gets married to a younger woman. She's 88. God bless him. And Carrie's clinic is part of a Baptist complex. So she's got her psychotherapy clinic. Right next to it is a fertility and maternity clinic. So Mel sends me a picture of him and his wife standing in front of the maternity fertility clinic signing. He's got such a brilliant sense of humor, right? So yeah. So I tell that story because how long ago does the trauma have to be that you heal? It doesn't matter, right? And the further we go on, if it becomes appropriate, I'll tell you a story of complex PTSD, massive PTSD in the civilian and military context that all heal, that they're just injuries that heal.
We talked about as we were warming up here, the 7 T's. I think we're at that stage where we can start talking about that. Why don't you share the 7 T's?
Yeah, the 7 T's became a framework for me presenting trauma. I did it as a webinar series, and then I present to Rotary clubs and other clubs. And it's a really good way for me to convey the traumas and injury that can heal. So the 7 T's go like this. The first T is the tragedy. We're traumatized. The trauma is in reaction to a tragedy. And that tragedy, it can happen to us. So something that happens to us, it can be something we do to others or something we witness happening to others that we either choose to or that we're unable to help in. And when that tragedy happens, our response is to go into survival mode inside our minds. And that survival mode is run by your sympathetic nervous system. So we go into this flight, fight, or freeze. And these tragedies can take one of two forms. They can be what are called small t traumas. These are things like being abandoned as a child, feeling like you're being abandoned, even if you're not. Gabor Mate has actually publicly apologized for helping mothers by teaching them to allow their babies to cry themselves to sleep. He has publicly apologized for that because he now knows that there is a potential for that to be small t traumatizing. Bessel van der Kolk, one of the leading thinkers on trauma, actually says that most small t traumas happen before we're verbal, so pre-verbal, under 2 years old. So these small t traumas happen. They're also called adverse childhood events or adverse childhood experiences. And so they're very powerful. And then we have the big T traumas, this episodal stuff, like a car crash or me witnessing the Hercules go down. These are large T traumas. So after you have this tragedy and you go into survival mode, trauma is a thief. It steals your ability to sleep primarily. That's the first thing is it'll steal, because to sleep, you have to submit. We're literally unconscious. And so your flight, fight, or freeze mechanism run by your amygdala is saying, no, I can't submit. I can't let Alan go to sleep. And we produce chemicals when we're in our flight, fight, or freeze, adrenaline, cortisol, and a chemical called noradrenaline. And noradrenaline does not let you sleep. It does not let the trigger for sleep, melatonin, take effect. So people struggle to go to sleep. And then during our sleep, Bob, we have cycles. So we have our circadian cycle, which is 24-hour day, but within the circadian cycle, we have ultradian cycles, which are 90 to 100 minutes long, and those are all day, all night. So, we're in light sleep and then we go into deep sleep and then we're in light sleep. And that's about a 90-minute cycle. So if you're fortunate enough to fall asleep at 45 minutes in or, on the next cycle, during that deep cycle, we go into REM sleep, rapid eye movement. During rapid eye movements, we dream. Dreams are metaphorical. And Matthew Walker talks about this, probably the preeminent sleep expert, that during REM sleep, when you're dreaming, we separate the emotions from the context and content of the memory. So the memory can leave your short-term memory, which is very finite in size, and go into long-term coherent memory. Coherence meaning you can tell the story again, right? And so it's in that process that the amygdala goes, no, and you get woken up in the nightmare, right? And it's in your forefront. And you'll notice all my traumatized clients have 2 to 3 to 4 wake-ups a night, every time in the bottom of that ultradian cycle. And now they're not getting any restorative sleep. They're not getting any quality sleep. And they wake up the next morning, they're either foggy or fuzzy-headed. They can't take the next task, the next honeydew. Hey, honey, take out the garbage, and they snap. They're on high alert. They're scanning for danger. Their flash to bang is instant. So trauma is a thief. Once it starts stealing your sleep, it starts stealing everything else. Because the next T, the third T, is torment. You're mentally tormented. You don't know why you're on high vigilance, high alert, why you can't even talk to your wife. But boom, you're there. And then we're tormented. And then if it goes unresolved long enough, we get to the fourth T, which is physical torture. Gabor Mate says all chronic fatigue, chronic pain is derived from unresolved trauma. So chronic pain, chronic fatigue, fibromyalgia. I can't say that I heal fibromyalgia, but my fibromyalgia clients, when we heal their traumas, they get off their meds. I had one 38-year-old woman who was using a walker 3 weeks a month with her fibromyalgia, and she's vibrant, healthy now, right? Because the fibromyalgia she hadn't slept for a decade. She was mentally tormented your body's got to give up. It can't, it has to. So when you go through those 4 T's, tragedy, theft, torment, torture, you have to be tenacious. The 5th T, if you're going to heal, you have to be tenacious. You have to say, no, I'm getting through this, and you've got to find a way. The system's not coming for you. Most people suffer in silence because they're afraid of the stigma of admitting they're traumatized, or they lack the finances to access proper psychotherapy or proper therapy. So they suffer in silence. So you have to be tenacious to heal. And if something works for you, great. But if something doesn't, find the next one until you find what works. And then if you do all of that, you're going to bump into a treatment that works. The 6th T of trauma is treatment. And the emerging research on treatment is that there are treatments that have way over 90% efficacy. So let's put this in perspective. Cognitive behavioral therapy, their published research is around 45% success rate with up to 80% recurrence. So that means you go out to your car and you start it 100 times and you pull out of the driveway and it stops 60% of the time. It only works 40% of the time, 40 out of 100. And then you drive a block further and it stops another 32 times. So, I always say when I'm presenting, I'm sorry if you're driving a Ford, I apologize, they only run things out of 100 times and then I get attacked. But seriously, you wouldn't drive that car. You wouldn't own that car. And yet that's, if you go on Psychology Today, that'll be trauma-focused cognitive behavioral therapy, will be the number one therapy being offered. Things like prolonged exposure have higher efficacy rates, but higher dropout rates, and they also have high recurrence. EMDR, especially the new age of EMDR, is highly effective, 65% or higher, lower recurrence. But we have modalities that have over 90%. There's actually a paper published on Psych Archive of 18 people I trained in Albuquerque, New Mexico, who have a 94% success rate with no recurrence. And the hallmark feature inside that is a technique within therapy called visual spatial tasking of the short-term working memory, which is radically different than cognitive conversational processing. And I'll just share with you, there was a study at Stanford, 2009, where they traumatized people. And they actually have a standard way of traumatizing people in virtual reality. and they test them with quantitative EEGs and blood work to make sure they're in full fight or freeze response. And then they broke them in two groups. This group went in and had mindfulness. The mindfulness was a conversation about, it was virtual reality, and the sharks didn't really eat you, and and you're going to go home. We're going to follow you for 30 days. And the study group went in another room, and they did this novel technique of visual spatial tasking. So doing things that creates imagery and creates a spatial movement, and it's tasking, because visual imagery can transmit and convey thousands times more information than verbal, right? And so they do this novel technique, and then they follow them for 30 days. And these people had 80% less symptoms than these people. These people couldn't sleep. They had all the symptoms. You know what the novel technique was? They played Tetris for 20 minutes. They played the cue. So they just went in, and now they're in the game. And I think they had created I'm not sure, but I think they had created a bit of a competitive environment, which tasks us more, right? You're looking over, scanning, you see what Billy's doing. You want to be Billy and Susie. Anyway, so 80%. And then there's just a lineage of studies. So when I learned that piece, I started looking at everything I've done in my career and then everything else that works. And whenever it works, there's this tasking of visual spatial, and there's less cognitive conversation. And the report from 2009 said, it was 2009, so 17 years ago, that there's a growing body of professionals inside of therapy that are wondering if cognitive conversations are actually exacerbating the symptoms. 17 years ago. And because Hebb's law, Donald Hebb was a Canadian researcher that came up with the concept of when you fire neurons together, they wire together, right? And that's the basis for neuroplasticity.
And now, more with Bob Wilkie and Tear Off the Tape.
Every time we talk about a trauma, if I'm re-traumatized, so when I told you the story about the Herc crashing, had I broke down crying, when I go to sleep tonight and I go through those ultradian cycles, that memory is going to get stored with that full latent charge on it. But because I could tell it clearly, coherently, and to the benefit of the listeners, hopefully, now it gets stored as a memory that has value that I can retell. So it's wired to a new location. So the treatment, the visual spatial tasking treatments do that. Right? The people go home that night and they sleep for the first time. And to me, that's the number one test of trauma and the number one test of resolution. And then the seventh T of trauma is triumph. Stories of triumph. I've just shared Mel's and some others. And I had the privilege of working with 14 traumatized women in a pilot initiative. There's an organization that mentors women coming out of human trafficking called Rising Angels. And the executive director, she might be somebody you'd love to interview. Her name's Katerina McLeod. She had been in the trafficking. She'd been trafficked in her teens, exited trafficking in her late 30s. Her stories are nothing short of horrific. I can say her name and share them because she's a public figure. She's everywhere on the internet sharing her stories. And we had just spectacular results. 3 women withdrew for their own reasons. 11 stayed. And of the 11, I got a third-party psychometric assessor to assess their psychometric condition, pre and post. And the 11 women, on a scale of 0 to 80, where 80 is the highest you can get, their average score was over 48, their mean score. And when we finished, their mean score was 6.1. The diagnostic threshold for trauma is 10. So we went from 48 out of 80 to 6.1. And that happened, the mean time in the program was 34 days, which in therapy that's light speed. And it included a 2-week break between my last visit with them and their exit interview. So really my mean time with them was around 20 days in total, which is hyper speed. Yeah. And those triumphs, I love to tell the story of Shane Dabrowski, a former firefighter in Calgary. I call him a superhero. He administered Arafat's Parkinson medicine to him before Arafat went on TV for the last time, because Shane was the head of the Palestinian Red Crescent in Jenin. This guy is like, I can't describe him. But he had trauma so bad that his body was shutting down. He'd get hives over his whole body. He had been to cancer clinics in the States. Nobody could do anything with them. He and I did our master's degree together. I did my master's degree at 49 and 50, and he and I ended up in Iraq in 2004. So he was the paramedic in charge of our group. If I got in trouble, he'd save my life. So we come back to Canada and he's struggling with trauma. So, I returned the favor. I did my trauma work with him. And Bob, while we were working, his hives started leaving his body. You could see them leave his neck because, sitting down with a clinician to work, he was triggered, right? So the hives were everywhere. He was drinking a 500 milligram bottle of, I think it's Benadryl, the antihistamine one, to keep his airways open every day. That's how bad the hives were. So today, Shane's in Ontario, actually working right now. But while we're working, I said, Shane, look. And he opens his shirt and the hives are disappearing. He rolls up his sleeve, the hives are disappearing. Then he looked at his watch. And I said, Shane, I understand the chest and the arm, but why'd you look at your watch? He said, well, I'm 2 hours past my meds. And the hives were leaving. So I understand that if he gets really revved up, he still gets some hives showing, but they're not debilitating anymore. And then as a paramedic, he had worked in all over Alberta. He worked in Fort Mac, but he'd worked in one First Nation community that he had his most traumatic experiences. So I believe that God sends us to Scene Fastfall sometimes just to see how good we are. And so Shane's driving home from work one day. He's no longer a paramedic, and he comes across an accident scene in the First Nation. And he gets out of his car. They called it in, and he kept that person alive until the paramedics came and stabilized and took control. And then he and his partner drove away. And he said, Alan, I did it, and it had no effect on me, other than, I was emotional in the moment on keeping a guy alive. He said, but no, he said, I was able to function. I could just do what I needed to do. And so, guys like Shane just reinforced with me that trauma is an injury that can heal. If we could convey nothing else, you, me, and everybody else around us who've been to the wall and back, it is that it's an injury that can heal.
So much, right? I think it's a testament, the stories that you're telling, just to how the body can heal, right? A 97-year-old going through it, and all of a sudden, right? The women who are trafficked, Shane, who you just mentioned, you, me, right? That's the importance of having these conversations, is for people who are stuck out there and maybe they've tried some things. I think you bring up a great point in number 6 of the 7 T's, just that treatment, really identifying the different things that are going to work for you, right? When I was going through my healing process, I spent some time with a brilliant man by the name of Bob Proctor, and he taught me about the power of my imagination and how we think in pictures. And so, you start to create a different picture associated with, what was causing that fear, terror, and helplessness. All of a sudden it's, a different framing. So I have a different picture, and now it doesn't have the effect that it used to have. And it took me a long time to find that. And I think somebody who is going through or recognizing that maybe they've got some past trauma, I think patience is one of the things that I learned, Alan, and I don't know how important or how much you preach that to people that you support in their healing, but I know that patience was a big one for me. How was it for you? Because a lot of people get frustrated and they go, screw it, I'm done.
I say this without any disrespect to anybody, but the research on cognitive behavioral therapy is 40 and 50 years old, most of it. They're still doing research today, but our knowledge of memories has evolved so much in the last sort of 15 years. One of the leading thinkers on how memories are created in stores is Karim Nader at McGill University. And based on his research, we now know that if we activate a memory, it enters this period where it's called labial. It's changeable and malleable. And that window is about 6 hours long, give or take. If you do something negative and put a person in a negative emotional state, so let's say you do a therapy session where you talk about the event, then the person goes home, grabs a beer and sits on their couch and pines over everything they've lost, that's the change that memory accepts. And that person starts to cycle down. This is the downward cycle that creates the 22 suicides per day stat, right? However, if when that memory is labial, if you can take the latent charge off it, during the session, they can tell the story to you clearly, coherently, in detail, without any negative arousal. That night when they go to bed, what Karim Nader says is the reconsolidation process, and Matthew Walker, when they're in the bottom of that ultradian cycle, that memory will actually be allowed to go become a coherent long-term memory. And so this is fast. This happens fast. And it happens fast when you can target the memory that you want to work on and work on it and pull the latent charge. And this is disbelievable to some people who listen, who have been in 6 months, 6 years, 10 years of therapy. The work I did with the Rising Angels women were 5 2-hour sessions in a 3-week period. So the 2-hour sessions is scientific because it captures a full ultradian cycle. A 1-hour session, you're not going to guarantee it, right? And then the tempo, 5 2-hour sessions in 3 weeks. Each of us live in our triggering environments. So if I work with you today and I don't see you for 2 or 3 or 4 weeks, you're back in your re-triggering environment, and the work we do erodes. So I want to work, then I want you to have 2 or 3 sleeps. So this ultradian cycle effect happens and the memories go into long term. And then I want to build on it. So, and it's not just me. So there was a study published at King's College where they took a group of charity therapists who work with military veterans. Everybody had to have unresolved long-term diagnosed PTSD. They did it at King's College, big reputable research university. And the results were 300% more effective than trauma-focused cognitive behavioral therapy in 1/6 of the time. Okay, so that's like me handing you a brick phone from 1992 and saying, Bob, here's your new cell phone, dude, be happy, right? And me with my iPhone 17 Pro, and you are not a chance, Alan, I'm not using it. That's the delta, right? And so, and then out of Loma Linda or Walter Reed Hospital, they're doing a side-by-side study of these visual spatial tasking techniques versus prolonged exposure. And the first output was the people doing these techniques where they make the memory labial, do the intervention, and they get results are far less stressful on the clinicians than the prolonged, because they don't have to hear the story. And of course, it's far less stressful on the client because they don't have to retell their story. And if you believe in Hebb's law, retelling the story fires and wires a negative pathway. So the tempo, what we're able to do in a very brief period of time now is extraordinary. And hallucinogenics touch on this. So if you go to ketamine therapy, you're still in therapy, right? You go into a ketamine clinic, you're in a doctor's clinic, there's multiple doctors around. And what the ketamine or any of the other hallucinogenics do is they bypass part of your brain that puts you in this very relaxed state. And then they activate the memory when you're very relaxed. So you're in this labial window, you're totally stoned, and you have your memory. And if they guide you, you and I've talked about the requirement for it to be constructed, not random. And they guide you and you come out when you come back from your high, that memory, that latent charge has gone on it. And it's very effective, but it takes a lot of repetitions, right? And it requires doctors in a medical institute. So like it's not my research, by the way, I have a page that articulates research, all these sites that I'm quoting. And the stats on these kind of techniques are very, very high. And there's a number of them. There's one called accelerated resolution therapy, which is a visual cueing one, much like EMDR, but more assertive. Sort of 60 to 70% success with very little recurrence. So there's a number of techniques. I just happen to use a technique that is in the realm of neurolinguistic programming. And the aha moment for me is that every technique within NLP that works for neuroscientific reasons, because it's using Hebb's law to wire and fire new pathways to positive emotional states. And you mentioned Bob Proctor. I've got 2 posts on my YouTube channel. I've got 430 posts. I've got 9,000 subscribers. I've got 2 posts. They both start with Bob Proctor saying, people use their imagination improperly. And I go, listen to Bob.
Yep. Well, that was it for me. That was the thing is like, I lived in that negative picture forever. Right. And all of the negative emotions went with it. So as I'm trying to figure out what the hell's going on with me and why do I keep doing this, it was because I was creating that same picture. Right. One of my favorite quotes that I write in my time journal, right, is my focus determines my reality. Well, my focus was solely on the pain and the suffering. Well, what am I going to get more of? More pain and suffering.
Correct. And we say, we have a similar saying. We say that our focus drives our behavior and our behavior creates our results. There is no failure. You just have some results you don't like. And if you want to change your results, they're just feedback about what you're focused on. So God bless that you met Bob and he said, change the image. Now, what Bob is doing does take time because, you would take out your journal, you'd create like an avatar or a vision for your future. You'd step into it, you fully associate it. And the more times you do that, now you're creating a new pathway in the jungle and hopefully not going down the old pathway. So the old pathway starts growing in, right? Metaphorically. And so, yeah, we just have a way to accelerate that. So in our work, you asked a really profound question when we first started, tell me about your young age, that's 0 to 7 now. So in my work, the client always comes with their presenting problem. Maybe they're traumatized and they can't maintain their temper, right? They have anger management issues. Cool. That's the presenting problem. But we know the root problem is much deeper. And so we have a way of going from the presenting problem to a root problem. And then we immediately go into, because we're into their unconscious collection of memories. When was the first time you did that? This root problem. It's always under 4 years old. Always. And certainly under 7, because part of your brain doesn't form until you're 7. And your unconscious mind is wide open to instructions from authority figure. So we do that. And then the second 2 hours that I work with clients, I use a technique called effective memory resolution. So effective memory is a memory that carries a negative charge from the past. It hasn't healed. It hasn't finished its resolution. And we clear the emotions, anger, sadness, fear, hurt, guilt, and shame. But when we're doing that, the root cause of these 6 emotions is always before you're 7 years old. Well, if you have a very intense anger or fear or sadness or guilt event before you're 7, surely that's an adverse childhood experience. So in this process, we release all the adverse childhood experiences and the events to now. And this beautiful thing I learned about 8 years ago from a researcher at Northeastern University, Lisa Feldman Barrett, is our brains are a predictive mechanism. So when you were describing, what you were focused on was leading to where you're going, your brain was actually predicting, hey, Bob, your day's going to be shitty. Hey, Bob, when you see Tim down at Tim Hortons, you're going to get angry. And our predictions get narrower. We lose our behavioral flexibility. We only have one bam, bam. Right? Our spouse doesn't want to be with us. Our kids don't want to be with us. Bob's going to get triggered. Alan's going to get triggered. Right? And so when we release past events and we come back to now, metaphorically in our minds, we also need to go out into the future and imagine a future event, which if it had happened in the past, I would have been triggered. How do I behave now? And instantly your imagination sees you behaving with resources. And the more times you future pace this, and this was Bob was teaching you in the way that he learned how to do it and convey it. And the more times you future pace it, now you're becoming able to have behavioral flexibility, which is empowerment, right? When you have behavioral flexibility, you're empowered. When you're traumatized and you have a very narrow reaction band, you're a victim. You don't have the bandwidth.
It's something that we teach athletes when we work with a lot of athletes and the visualization process is so powerful, but the way that it was always taught is just see yourself doing good. Right. And what we've done is like, okay, I mean, it's good to have those positive pictures, that you've had success in. But what we really want to focus on is seeing yourself making the play and having the reaction that you're trying to avoid and seeing yourself doing that differently, right? Creating that different visual. So yeah, I made a bad pass and it caused a goal where normally I'd go smash my stick and pout for the rest of the game. I see myself taking the drink of water, You know what I mean? Practicing my little mental mantra and then going out and playing, right? Like I wouldn't normally. And it's been so powerful in teaching these young athletes that, the reframing of the pain. I think we get really tolerant in our pain too. I know that was something that I recognized in myself, Alan, was, the physical pain. So here's the tear off the tape. You learn how to deal with it. And I think a lot of people just become accustomed to some sort of pain going on in their life. But it really wasn't until I was doing a session with some people and I was telling the story of hurting myself terribly and the doctor saying, listen, your pain threshold is dangerous. You're going to hurt yourself. And it was the connection to the emotional pain, not the physical pain. And I think having that awareness that we don't have to live in that pain, Alan, all of these things that you're talking about can get us out of that pain so that we can start to live that healthy, better lifestyle.
We started this with me telling you I was a sickly child. And, I'm going to share how old I am just to get it in context. I turned 71 on May 8th. I'm, 190 pounds. I'm fit, strong, healthy. I go hang out with my 3 kids at sport fields. I can still ski. I still do the things I want to do. I have no intention of retiring ever. I have purpose. And so why do I tell that story? Well, my mom and dad died, one at 60, one at 61, one of cancer, one of heart disease. The world would tell me I've come from a bad gene pool. Well, I don't buy that. I believe in epigenetics. My thoughts, my feelings, my environment give rise to how my genes express. And so today, I'm not on a single medication. And to put a nail in it, some people say I'm stupid, but my wife wanted to get more life insurance on me, right? Go figure. So now I sleep like this, Bob. But she went to get more life insurance, as we should. We've got young children and cost of everything's gone to the moon. And I can't get life insurance because I don't have medical records.
Yeah.
All right. So somebody would say, well, you're stupid. You should go see your doctor every day. Well, I'm very in tune with my body. I don't have any aches and pains. I don't have any manifestations of digestive issues or heart. So the message here is if I lived with that trauma, that in 1990, had I bought into my diagnosis of depression, stayed on Prozac, stayed suffering, where would I be today, 26 years later? Would we be having this conversation? Had you not gone on your healing journey, had you not sought out Bob Proctor, had you not gained the capacity to create new imagery for the future, to create your behavioral flexibility, would we be here today? No. Share one other story. I mean, sometimes you get in front of audiences, I don't know what the feedback you get and people, sometimes the feedback is, well, you don't know what I've been through. Well, I don't. Okay. But I'm going to tell you what I've been through. I shared some stories, but here's a story that I use as absolute proof that you can tell the tragedies of your life in a way that they give you purpose and meaning without bringing you down. So in 1992, my first wife and I were pregnant. Well, we weren't pregnant. She was pregnant with our first son. And she's robust, she's healthy, she's vibrant. And we get to week 32, we're in the OBGYN office. And I am, at that time, I'd done a lot of risk management work, overseas and that. So I'm really aware of how fast people move and the tonality of their voice to pick up energy levels. And I noticed a change in the OBGYN, right? And he said, look, I want you guys to go get the ultrasound. This is a big baby. I want to make sure everything's okay. So he had a story. So in Vancouver, we go to ultrasound clinic, and I didn't know there were tiers of ultrasound clinic. There's the, hey, this is just cut and dry. Let's get this over. And then there's the ones that, it's more serious. But when you get a serious issue, you end up in a serious ultrasound clinic with really high tech stuff. So we were in tier 3. And back then in 92, I'm in the waiting room and my wife goes in the room. I can see the door. Clinician goes in. And then about 10 minutes later, she comes out and the clinician does this one. Looks 2 ways. She's looking for help and she goes find help. Second clinician goes in, then they call me in. And they showed me the image of my son's heart. And the 4 chambers are supposed to be there, but one's missing. 32 weeks. We're moving now, right? So they said, we don't want to say what this means ultimately. Please go back to your OBGYN. We'll send the file over. So we cross town again. We go back there. And he said, look, we need to go. And that's where I learned about tiers. We're going to send you to the top tier ultrasound. So now we're in there right away, like right away. We go to the front of the queue, we're in there. And now that, we're not looking at a little picture, we're looking at a big picture in color. You can see the blood movement, right? You can see these. And the chamber's there, but it's 8% developed. So he has what's called a hypoplastic left ventricle, which means as long as he's in his mom's belly, he'll live forever. As soon as he's born, the clock starts running, because when you're born, part of the heart forms and that chamber has to work. It's only 8% there. It's not going to work. It's 1992. The choices are let nature take its course, or pack your bags when he's born, get to Loma Linda Hospital and pray that a donor heart appears. We'll keep him alive on drugs. We'll do the open heart surgery, and then we'll do what other surgeries come next. And it's the nascent era of the internet. We could do a bit of research. We learned that most kids go through 4, 5, 6 operations. They're kept on immunosuppressants. The oldest child in 1992 had a heart operation, was about 12 or 14 years old, all with complications. And we made the decision to let nature take its course. I've been criticized for it. I'm okay with it. I believe I made the right decision. And then we got the hospital to give us a room outside of maternity. So as soon as the baby was born, we whisked the whole family away from maternity, because it's going to be a bad outcome. And we invited all our friends and family to come join us and celebrate, instead of just hunkering down. A lot of people would have become private, wouldn't have shared it, right? Just hunker down. My sister flew from Sudbury to Vancouver to be at that party. We called him BK. BK was held, his birthday was just on Friday. BK was held by as many people there. I thought there was, throngs, but my sister will tell you there's 10 or 20 people. But he was held and loved unconditionally by 10 or 20 people. He loved unconditionally. He breastfed, he had a bath, he had a bowel movement. I said he smiled, but all the women said, no, that's just gas, right? But I held him in my arms as he passed away. And I can tell that story clearly, coherently, without any negative arousal. Yeah, I'm sad that, his birthday was just a couple days ago. And I actually went. I didn't realize what I was doing. I went on Friday night to a premiere of a movie called The Shot, of an 18-year-old hockey player who passed away shortly after getting his COVID inoculation. And I'm sitting in the audience with my friend. I said, this is unbelievable. This is my son's birthday, right? So I'm in here watching a movie about another man lose his son. But I can tell that story, and I tell that to inspire other people. Now it's filled with purpose. Had I not, so what Bob taught you was to give your life meaning, draw new pictures, right? Had I not given my son's meaning, that he was loved unconditionally, I believe his life was perfect, just short. And nobody gets a certificate that says we're going to live 1 day or 10,000 days. You just take your shot, right? And so had I not been fortunate enough to do that, I would have become an angry drunk. I would have been angry at God, at my wife, at the medical system. I would have just been a miserable, angry person. And, fortunately, my first wife and I had 2 kids, and now I have 3 more. So I have 5 kids, 6 kids in total, 5 alive. And, you cherish every one. Of course, we all cherish our kids, but, my first 2 children hung stockings for their older brother every Christmas. We embraced it. We celebrated it. And so when I talk to people and people say, well, you don't know what I've been through. I said, well, I don't know, but let me share my story. And nothing has any meaning except the meaning we give it. And so the meaning I give his life is perfect.
A lot of people, when I share my story, when we're showing the documentary Sideways, they automatically like to compare it. Well, mine's not as bad as yours. And I stop them right there. And what I tell them is like, it's yours. We don't compare trauma. If it's causing anything like I described, you have the same thing that I do. And I think a lot of people do get into that comparison. Well, it's not that bad. And the minute that we minimize, right, then we're not really going to deal with what we have to deal with.
If you and I grabbed 100 random people, if I flew out to Calgary, we grab our 100 random people and we'll take them to northern Kenya. There's a refugee camp called Dahab on the Kenya-Somalia border. And we'll take 100 people from Calgary to go work there. It's a camp built for a couple thousand people, and there's 50,000 people in it. So shit happens every day. And the stuff that happens to a Calgarian would be off the scale. If we take 100 random people, when that happens, Bob, 10 of them will go back to the hooch and they'll say, look, we need to have a meeting. because that was bad. We need to make sure it doesn't happen. They start processing, they start taking action, right? They do that. There's 10 or 20 people at the other end of the spectrum that'll go back to their hooch, they'll start crying, and I'll have to medevac them within 48 hours. They're going down. And 60 or 70 people in the middle are on a continuum, a spectrum, right? And so, in my life, I've totally shared some stories, I've shared some negative stuff, but I'm closer to these 10. I'm closer to these 10, right? I can make sense of it and move forward, but the Hercules that strikes me 27 years or longer, 30 years later, was still in there, right? So you're right. You can't rank them. There's no scientific way of ranking what you've been through or we've just been through it. We need to resolve it and heal. And I think the real message here is that whether you believe in God or creation, whatever you believe in, we are magnificent. We are magnificent beings. We have the ability to heal. When we cut our skin, the skin heals. And you don't know how that happens. You're not doing it. It just starts knitting. You're a hockey player. You broke bones, lots of them. You get a cast on, and most of the times you started playing hockey again before you should have, at least by a week, right? And you went out, and your body just kept you running, right? And we've all gone without enough sleep, and our body does what it does. And we've all gone without the right food. We are magnificent. We were built to heal and thrive. And so trauma is just an injury. It's a psycho-emotional injury. It has a structure, it has a form, and it can heal. And I believe we need to embrace it like you embraced Bob Proctor's teachings.
Yeah, one of the things that I've learned is, I always wanted to live a big life. And when we want more out of the life that we've been given, we're going to have to risk more. And people don't understand that with that risk comes these potential traumatic moments, right? Whether it's broken bones, whether it's complete disappointment, or whether it's just seeing the unimaginable. It's part of life too. And I see so many people that go through something and then shy away from the rest of life. And it's really, the bigger and bolder life we can live, the better it is, right? When I was young, it was always, the one with the most toys when they die wins. I've shifted that as I've gotten older, and it's like the one who has the most experiences throughout life, right? And I think that's what trauma did for me for a long time, is it removed any sort of positive. I had lots of great experiences. Now I see that. When I was stuck in the trauma, I didn't see any of that, right? All I saw was the pain and the suffering. So it's not until we kind of shift, go through the 70s to those triumphs that we can look back at our life and go, you know what? Yeah, it was tough, but man, was that fucking cool.
Well, and now I have to be mindful, because every day my whole work life is about traumatized people. And we talk about being trauma informed. I find it an overworked phrase, because being trauma informed doesn't heal trauma. It allows you to engage traumatized people in a more kind and generous way. But I walk through them all. And we know from McMaster University that 1 out of 3 women have been sexually traumatized in North America. And whenever I say that to a female audience, they say, well, only 1 out of 3 report it. And then the second stat is 2 out of 5 men have been sexually traumatized. And when I tell that to male audiences, they say, well, what man was going to report it? So we know it's underreported, but I walk through them all, and I do this game with myself, because I used to be very gregarious and I will say disrespectful people's space. I always wanted to engage with them. I had no problem walking up right behind a person, put my hand on their back, say, hey, what you looking at? And now I realize that 1 out of 3 women, 2 out of 5 men. So I walk through them all and I just count. I'll count women or men, doesn't matter. So, right? I count 3 women. 1, 2, you. 1, 2, you. And it's just like, oh my God, all these people are hurting, right? And they don't need to hurt. They don't need to hurt, but it's given me an intense respect, a far greater respect. It's given me I would argue better boundaries, and not perfect boundaries, and the experiences you're generating for yourself and for the people you brought around you, your team and the people you touch, that's rocket fuel for life. I think it's easy to wake up in the morning, I bet.
Yeah, excited about every day rather than kind of dreading it, right? Like that whole shift in perspective and mindset, it's been a godsend. And why wouldn't I want that more? So why wouldn't I continue to do the work? Why wouldn't I address issues when they start to arise? Because I know what they feel like now, right? Like this, with this new awareness, it allows me to live my best life. And however much I get, I'm going to make the most of it, because I spent too much time in my ignorance, which caused me to spend too much time in my pain, which caused me to, miss out on a large chunk of my life. And I just don't want to do that anymore. Alan, it's been so wonderful having you here. I've loved the conversation. How does somebody find you? Because this is going to pique a lot of interest. How do they reach out and get some of the support that you're offering?
Yeah. So the easiest way, if they see my name down there, just at Alan Kanerva on YouTube, same on LinkedIn. And I post just tons of material out there. And then my website is called Inspired, but it's spelled inappropriately. It's inspyrd.com. And there's a free consultation link there. Where we have a series of pages we're building. They are pillars. And so if you go up under, I forget what it is, library, it'll say it like an initials AMR. AMR stands for Effective Memory Resolution. There's a whole body of knowledge there. And yeah, I'm always, if somebody's interested, there's always available for a 30-minute free consult to talk about where they're at and where they might go. Yeah. So that's the best way to reach me.
We'll make sure that we include that in the final production. And then when we post everything, we'll make sure that we have it in there too. Alan, thank you so much for your time today. I really appreciate you being here. Thank you for sharing your stories. Thank you for doing the work. And hey, 71, now I got a new target. If I can look like you when I'm 71, I'm going to be happier than a pig in shit. So thank you so much for being here.
Let me close with this. If that's your goal, dude, and you're a Bob Proctor fan, then you've got to create an avatar in your mind. Matthew McConaughey talks about this, right? Who am I going to be 10 years from now? I'll never catch him. So there you go. All right. Thank you, Bob. I really appreciate this. It's been brilliant.
Great episode. So much good information around the healing. So many stories that Alan shared with us of his own and all the people that he's supported. Listen, if you're struggling with anything, if any of this has resonated with you, please don't hesitate to reach out. You can find us at igotmind.ca. You can find Alan and his work at inspyrd.com, INSPYRD. Take care of yourself. Thanks for being here. And listen, there's nothing wrong with tearing off that tape. So have a good day, and we'll see you in the next episode.
You've been listening to Tear Off the Tape. For more about this show and how you can continue the dialogue about trauma, go to igotmind.ca.
A production of the Sound Off Media Company.
That's the sound that unites everyone who loves music and the stories behind it. The theme song for Records and Rockstars, the podcast born of the radio show. I'm Jeff Woods, inviting you to come listen as I shine a light on music and the rock stars who make it. Join me for Records and Rockstars on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. More at jeffwoodsradio.com.